Grand Prix. A statement was released earlier this afternoon which said Formula One can confirm it has terminated its contract with the Russian Grand Prix promoter, meaning Russia will not have a race in the future. And this morning there was a U-turn by the International Paralympic Committee, meaning that athletes from Russia and Belarus cannot now take part in the Winter Paralympics in Beijing, which get underway tomorrow. The IPC reversed its decision following widespread international criticism.
We have decided to refuse the athlete entries from RPC and NPC Belarus. To the para-athletes from the impacted countries, we are very sorry that you're affected by the decisions that your government took last week in breaching the Olympic truce. You are victims of your government's actions.
And here's what the Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, had to say on the decision.
There are other powerful ways of isolating rogue regimes. Culture and sport can be equally as effective as economic sanctions if used in the right way. Culture is the third front in the Ukrainian war. Across sport, across the arts and entertainment, we're ostracising Putin on the global stage. Putin is now suffering a sporting and cultural Siberia of its own making.
Before we head to the break, let's take a quick check on today's weather.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Today, mild and less windy than it has been recently, with cloud and patchy rain edging eastwards. Much of Britain is going to be murky this afternoon with hill fog and outbreaks of rain, but eastern England looks mainly fine. Meanwhile, Ireland and Northern Ireland will be brighter with just a few showers, mainly in the west. That rain will move a little further east, allowing more of West Wales and the southwest of England to dry up. There'll be some late sunshine there as well.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Coming up after the break, it is our live Q&A session with a panel of experts on this Ukraine invasion. They'll be answering your questions. That's coming up in a couple of minutes' time. Stay with us. Hello, welcome back to Sky News. Time now to get answers to some of your questions about what is happening in Ukraine. I have with me our panel of experts, security and defence analyst Michael Clark, a familiar face to you here on Sky News over the last couple of days. We're also joined by Keir Giles, a senior consulting fellow on the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House, and Dr Heather Papowitz, an emergency management specialist at the World Health Organisation. Thank you to you all for joining us here. So many viewers getting in touch, so many questions. Michael, I'll come to you first, if I may. This question is there any way this could end with Putin's demands satisfied enough that Russia withdraws from Ukraine?
Very difficult to see, since Mr. Putin has said that Ukraine has no right to exist, that it's not a real state. So what is there to negotiate about? However, the fighting from Ukraine's point of view has got to stop, or they will lose completely. So there is a possibility of saying, well, let's at least talk, to stop the fighting, let's talk about the possibility of something like the Austrian State Treaty of 1955, which guarantees neutrality for a country in Europe. At least there's a model there. The Ukrainians won't agree to it, but they might start talking about it in order to live to fight another day. Yeah,
Keir, I'll put that question to you as well. Within the last half an hour, we heard about a conversation at the request of Vladimir Putin that he speak to the French President Emmanuel Macron, and he reiterated calls to demilitarise Ukraine, and he reiterated his demands and saying that, you know, unless they're met, this invasion will continue.
That's exactly right. And in fact, he said that unless there is a rapid meeting by Ukraine of his demands, he will actually present more demands rather than fewer. But Michael Clark is absolutely right. What is there to negotiate about when effectively Putin has demanded the destruction of Ukraine as a state?
Keir, here's a really interesting one, and it's something we've been discussing more over the last couple of days since the invasion. This comes from a viewer that says, what do you believe an average Russian knows about this conflict? What do you think they support, pro-war or pro-peace? And how long do you think this conflict will last? It's interesting, isn't it? Because we have seen protests on the streets of Russia.
There have been protests, yes, and the interesting thing is how exactly are those people getting their information from the outside world about what's going on? Because Russia has spent years trying to prevent that kind of information from actually reaching its population. The clampdowns not only on traditional media, but also on social media, trying to put these filters in place between Russia and the outside world, so the only picture they get of what is going on is what's being delivered to them by state media, which of course is still at this point talking about a special operation in those eastern provinces of Ukraine and pretending that the main invasion isn't actually happening. So somehow Russians are in fact getting this information and they're not happy about it. And there are some very brave individuals, not just among ordinary people, but actually prominent individuals within Russia who are making their opposition to the war felt. And they know that they will be risking consequences as Russia clamps down even further on dissent inside the country.
Yeah, Michael, how tightly can Russia control the flow of information in the country? Obviously, we know that state media trots out Putin's lines. You know, that is it. But there is the rise of social media. There, you know, Russians have friends and relatives in the West that will be hearing what's going on.
Yes, I mean, they're giving it a good try to clamp right down, and they've done a great deal in the last 2 years to clamp down and arrest people and close down social media and vaguely independent news sources, but they haven't done it completely. And you're absolutely right. They don't just have friends in the West, they have lots of friends and family in Ukraine. And the telephone system has got to be up and running at some point in the future. So it may be a drip of truth, but the truth will never be absent from Russian society, but it may take a while for it to get through. And remember that, I mean, President Putin isn't that unpopular within the broad society, because most ordinary Russians think, well, he's put us back on the map again and he's done some useful things. It will take time if we're thinking about a broad movement towards truth and understanding on the part of the Russian population, but it will happen.
Yeah, time the Ukrainian people, though, sadly don't have. Let's look at this next question, which I'll put to all three of you. What would NATO's response be if Russia deployed a chemical, biological or nuclear weapon in Ukraine? This is the worst case scenario that so many people are thinking about, and it's giving people sleepless nights. Michael, can you give us your take on this first.
Yeah, we crossed the line in Syria in 2013 in appearing to condone or tolerate the use of chemical weapons. There's always been an enormous threshold. Chemical, biological were out of reach, and of course nuclear is completely out of reach. Well, we've crossed one of those thresholds in Syria. If it were used in Ukraine, the condemnation would be huge. Would NATO attack Russia because of it? No, they wouldn't. They won't, because that would be war. But the condemnation would be off the scale to anything that we've seen so far.
Yeah, Kim, Michael mentioned Syria there, but it's happened a little bit closer to home in the UK, the use of Novichok in Salisbury. So many people will say, you know, this kind of warfare has already begun. What do you think that the West's response would be if it gets to that worst-case scenario?
Well, as far as NATO is concerned, unfortunately, NATO made it very clear from the very early stages of this crisis that it was abandoning Ukraine to its fate. NATO member states were saying, no, there won't be any intervention, any direct military support to Ukraine. And that effectively gave Putin the green light to move in. So as we've seen with the discussion over imposing no-fly zones over the last few days, anything that Western countries now did to try to protect Ukraine would be an escalation, would be, in fact, attacking Russia, fighting their way in to try to protect Ukraine and fulfilling all of President Putin's fantasies. So it would be a huge step in the other direction now, a reversal of all of NATO's policy to actually step in and try to protect Ukraine when it's already declared it's not going to.
Yeah, Heather, I'm sure that comes as what we've heard from Michael and Keir there. It offers no solace to the people that would be affected by some kind of chemical weapons attack, biological or nuclear. What does that mean for a humanitarian mission? I mean, it's unimaginable, and it would make any work of a humanitarian effort team really, really difficult if it isn't really difficult already.
Yeah, I think you hit it right there. It's actually already extremely challenging to provide healthcare. Our staff on the ground are working from bunkers, listening to bombing at night. Health staff have to go to hospitals that are being targeted. We have one documented actual attack on a hospital. We have others that we're looking at. So right now it's extremely unsafe to provide healthcare. For the health workers going to work, we've already heard just from staff on the ground, a nurse was shot in the streets. Other health staff are leaving. So really the access to healthcare right now is already as constrained as it could possibly be. So this would be a whole other layer on what's already significantly challenging right now.
Yeah, Heather, how difficult is it to get aid into Ukraine at the moment? Obviously, we've seen the masses of people trying to get out. It's a situation that's very much in flux from one area of the country to another, but we've heard talk of people appealing for there to be humanitarian corridors to be agreed with Russia. That seems to be very slow moving, but is that what's going to be the vital piece for your work?
Yeah, I think that would, that's definitely vital. Having that access, that safe access for humanitarian aid, for us to get medical supplies in, to get staff in, and to get just people on the ground to help support the response. That would significantly support that. But we're still working. So humanitarian aid is still continuing to the people that need it on the ground. But it's the access has been significantly constrained, but we are still working, doing our best at all hours to try to get support to the people who need it.
Yeah, no matter how bad it gets, that humanitarian effort continues. Michael, let's talk about this question. If the war stops tomorrow, what happens to Putin? Are restrictions lifted? Would he be welcomed back? Or are we now entering a new Cold War?
Yes, I think the world changed last Thursday. This is day 8 of the new world that we are now in, because last Thursday was a bit like 9/11, a bit like the November the 11th when the wall came down in 1989. Nothing will be the same again afterwards. And whatever happens now, we in Europe are dealing with a revisionist Russia. We're not going to try and baby Mr. Putin along anymore. We're not going to try and pretend that we can live with it and deal with it and contain him. This man, or Russia under his leadership, has shown itself to be a threat to European security and a big problem for world politics. So we won't go back to the way we were, of hoping that we could somehow get along with him. And if the war stopped tomorrow, then we're still with that reality. And of course, the war won't stop tomorrow. And my own view is that this is peak Putin. After this, he's finished. I don't know how long that will take. It might be some years, might actually be quite quick, might even be quite sudden. But he's got nowhere to go after this because he's now in the category of Saddam Hussein or Colonel Gaddafi. He's the pariah leader. And whereas Mr. Zelensky has emerged as the greatest figure of the 21st century so far, Mr. Putin is now the greatest tyrant, the greatest vandal of the 21st century so far. He's got nowhere to go.
Yeah, Keir, I mean, Michael put it there very succinctly. Vladimir Putin in the same category as Saddam Hussein and Colonel Gaddafi. In that sense, he's got nothing to lose. Why would he stop the war now, which takes away all hope for the people of Ukraine? It's all or nothing now for Putin.
Nothing at the moment to deter President Putin from pushing forward. And when he's offered an off-ramp and a de-escalation and a way of stepping back from the crisis, that tends to overlook the fact that as far as he's concerned, he is winning. But just coming back to what Michael said, yes, I think we have finally reached a turning point where, for once, Russia will not be welcomed back and people won't try to return to business as usual afterwards. The really amazing thing about the last week for long-term Russia watchers has been not the invasion, but the fact that Europe has finally woken up to the challenge it has been facing for all these years and realized that it needs to deal with Russia as an aggressor, which may threaten other countries next. That's what's really changed here, as opposed to Russia's behavior and the direction that Russia was traveling in.
Heather, I have a question here from Josephine, who has got in touch with us. She says, how will governments make it safe for all people in Ukraine to leave if they need to, given that we are seeing airports being bombed and other routes out, like train stations and land borders, either restricted or severely damaged?
I mean, again, looking at the safe passage, so having that humanitarian assistance and having the corridors for people to come and go. I know now, I think today we were upward of 1 million people crossing the border, and they're coming in exhausted from a week of being in a very critical situation. I mean, after 2 years of COVID, so they've had a significantly reduced access already to essential services, including healthcare. So they're coming over the border and really need to have assistance there as well. So we're looking at providing that at the border and the countries that are hosting the people coming in.
Keir, this is quite a timely question, given the news we heard from the UK government. It's trying to come up with special legislation, something to speed along the sanctions for oligarchs. This question says, is freezing assets enough? Why can't assets be sold and funds held for Ukraine rebuilding?
Yes, the UK's response to the problem of Russian dirty money and its influence on Russian domestic politics has been an ongoing challenge in dealing with Russia. Again, it's nothing new. It's a problem which has been flagged up long before, and the reluctance of the British government in particular to grip that problem and deal with it has been deeply damaging to efforts to try to constrain President Putin. However, when we are looking at freezing the assets of oligarchs, questions need to be asked not only about where the money came from, but also what the actual effect of that is going to be. Because often the influence that oligarchs have on President Putin, or even that major businessmen have on that inner circle that makes decisions within Russia, may be overstated. What we've seen over the last period is President Putin retreating further and further down his own rabbit hole of conspiracy theories about what's happening in the outside world, when he seems to have been in isolation because of potentially his fears about COVID. So what exactly are people going to do to try to change his mind if they don't have that direct access to Putin to complain to him?
Here's a question that illustrates just how far-reaching this conflict is. It ends up in space. Are the US and UK, Michael, do you think, still going to participate in joint Russian space missions? I mean, or is everything on the table for ties being cut?
Yeah, there was a lot of cooperation between the Americans and the Russians in space during the 90s, after the Cold War, which has now sort of just dribbled to not very much. But the Russians still launch British satellites and European satellites from their stations. They said yesterday that they'd stop doing it, and that's not surprising because that's a tit-for-tat sort of response. I think we have to accept that things like this, space cooperation, things that were perfectly sensible, normal, functional arrangements, will probably all come to an end for the time time being. Some of them might be restarted again, but it really all depends on where we are with Mr. Putin's government in 3 or 4 months' time. And indeed, if he is still leading the government in 3 or 4 months' time. So for now, we have to accept that's one of the collateral damages, I think, from this whole miserable war.
Of which there will be many. Let's talk about this next question. Michael, I'll put it to you. How easy or hard will it be for Putin to consolidate or hold the territorial gains he's made in Ukraine so far?
Completely impossible. There's a rule of military, policing and civil order that in an ordered society, you need about 2 people per 1,000 as policemen or women. 2 per 1,000. In a troubled society, you need 20 per 1,000. So in a society that's in a state of insurgency, 20 per 1,000 have got to be in the security forces. Just work it out. If Ukrainians, 45 million people, if they don't want the Russians there, and even 1% of Ukrainian society is prepared to do something about it and attack the Russians, they simply would need about 1 million troops in order to hold down Ukraine. It is a sheer impossibility. And President Putin has landed himself with a totally unrealistic scenario of dominating a country that hates him, that hates the Russians or the Russian soldiers, and is determined not to be suppressed. It's an impossible situation for him, even if he wins the war of the cities, which, of course, is now in full flood.
Yeah, it just comes down to basic maths, isn't it? Everybody is talking about this conflict. I was actually talking to somebody in the makeup room before they came in. They said, 1 million refugees have left the country already, but aren't there over 40 million people in Ukraine? That's a lot of people left to put up a resistance. As you said, Keir, I'd like to get your take on that.
Well, excuse me, Michael is absolutely right that it may be hard for Russia to control an insurgency, a resistance movement against its occupation. But we also have to look at the fact that over the long term, Moscow has a 100% success rate at suppressing resistance movements of that kind through vicious, savage, brutal repression and not counting the cost of civilian casualties and the destruction that they wreak when they are trying to do so. That is what we need to bear in mind when thinking about the word resistance. It's not a romantic affair. It's not the way we think of it in the West as perhaps the French resistance during the Second World War. It will be absolutely savage and it will be scorched earth tactics by the Russians to try to suppress it in the way that they know how. And that is the reason why one of the main indicators that an invasion was in fact imminent was the move up to the Ukrainian border of Russia's National Guard, Rosgvardia, the internal security force that is designed to suppress Russia's own population, including using heavy weaponry all possible, but also specifically designed to control territories, occupied territories of places that Russia has just invaded. So Russia does appear to be prepared for this, and the past precedents of how Russia goes about suppressing these kinds of movements is something which should give anybody that is intending to embark on them serious pause for thought.
I just want to squeeze in a couple of quick questions before time is up. Michael, how are all these weapons that the West is sending being secured? What if they're confiscated by the Russians?
Well, they may be captured, but most of what we've sent are fairly small. I mean, shoulder-launched or anti-personnel weapons. The chances are that they will be destroyed rather than be captured. So I don't think many of those will fall into Russian hands, as it were.
This question, why don't the Ukrainians bomb the stationary Russian convoys? Michael, I've been asked that a lot because we've been talking for the last 2 days now about that 40-mile long Russian convoy heading towards the capital, Kiev. It's slow progress. A lot of people saying, we can see where it is. Why isn't it being attacked? Yeah,
if we had our air power, we'd take it out completely. But the Ukrainians don't have that sort of air power left, it seems. But also, they have been bombing it. They've been using the Bayraktar missile, the Bayraktar drones, the Turkish drones, but also their Punisher drones that they've developed themselves, electric drones, which are stealthy, can't be picked up easily. They only carry 1 bomb. But they've been very clever, and they've been trying to bomb the fuel and the ammunition parts of the convoy in order to slow the whole thing down. So rather than trying to destroy hundreds of vehicles, they've been trying to destroy the enablers to hundreds of vehicles, and the Russians are making a complete mess of keeping this armed convoy on the move.
Final question to you, Heather. Again, lots of people asking this. What is the best way to help the people of Ukraine? We've seen pictures of European cities around the world, donations being made, physical donations, baby clothes, food, blankets and the like. But the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, said the other day, look, actually money is more useful. Donate money, not physical items. What is the best way for people watching this unfold at home, feeling helpless, to help those most at need?
Yeah, that's exactly it. give money, and supplies and other necessary items will be bought based on the needs on the ground. So the teams on the ground are looking at the needs and making assessments, and they'll know what exactly is needed, what medical supplies, what other type of supplies are needed. So giving money is the best way, and that way they can tailor the response to what is needed at the time.
OK, Heather, really good to hear from you. Dr. Heather Papowitz, Emergency Management Specialist at the World Health Organization. Michael Clark, our Resident Security and Defence Analyst, and Keir Giles, Senior Consulting Fellow on the Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House. Thank you so much. A fascinating and frightening discussion in equal measure. We'll have more after this short break.